Welcome back to the On the Pegs podcast. I'm Abigail Bazzelli, and today's episode is a special one recorded in the AMA Hall of Fame in Pickerington, Ohio. In this episode, I sat down with David Pyle and Curt Comer to talk about their experiences competing at the very first Trial to Nations in 1984, held in what was then Soviet-controlled Poland. Both riders were part of the U.S. effort at the historic event, and this conversation marks the first time they've ever sat down together to reflect on that experience. Having just attended the most recent Trial to Nations in Italy this past September, it was really interesting to hear their stories and compare how the event began with what it's grown into today. We talk about the challenges of travel and competing internationally at the time, the unique circumstances surrounding the first TDN, and the excitement of representing the United States on the world stage. Let's get into it. Curt, do you want to go ahead and kick us off with your background and experience? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, be glad to. So, I grew up in a motorcycle family, and my dad and my uncle, they rode enduros, but at some point along the way, they decided, or at least my dad decided, that trials was pretty cool, and he started riding trials, and I was 12 when I started riding. We pretty much started in trials and rode in the Southeast. There was a new Southeast series started in 1974, and then kind of progressed up through the ranks in that. And then in the mid-70s was really I always call it the glory days for trials because, there were more bikes sold back then and a lot of events. And, there were Honda, there were Bultaco, Montesa, and Osa already pretty well established. And then all the Japanese brands, Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki, entered into the market. And, of course, that put trials bikes on the floor of like every dealership. So there was a lot of visibility and local clubs and that sort of thing. And I guess where I was just blessed is because I kind of came good during that era. And there were, a number of paid rides since, all these manufacturers fielded teams. And, as a kid in high school, I certainly had a dream of riding motorcycles for a living. And so that just kind of worked out.
And you rode for Kawasaki?
I rode for Kawasaki in
Factory Kawasaki.
1975 and 76, and that was a wonderful experience. My relationship with the people I interacted with Kawasaki was great. The bike was really good and very supportive. But then they, like the other Japanese manufacturers, I guess their sales didn't meet their expectations, and so they pulled out of the U.S. market. So at that time, in 1977, I went up to Montesa as a sponsored rider from Cosmopolitan Motors, was the importer. And I rode for them and the Montesa, for the most of my championship years. I had, a few experiences on other brands, but I kept coming back to Montesas. And in fact, that's what I ride now is a new Montesa or newer. But anyway, that was the background. I started riding some world championships, at least the U.S. rounds in 78 and 79 and 80. I got the opportunity in 79 to spend some time in England. So I had an ACU license and rode British championships, not the whole series, but rode British championship events and the world championship events that I could get to. And so that really just kind of, I progressed during that period of time. I was young and hungry and, enjoying the lifestyle. So was able to come back and win the U.S. Championship in 1981. And, and that's kind of been wonderful. The old timers still remember that. So it's a prideful thing, I guess. But it opened a lot of opportunities. I had full Montesa factory sponsorship in 82. And then moving on to the Trial to Nations. So like you mentioned, David and myself and Morgan Kavanaugh were the U.S. team at the first Trial to Nations, and it was in Poland. And what an experience that was. So.
Perfect. And David, can you tell me a little bit about your career in trials leading up to the first TDN?
Yeah. So I started riding trials in 1972, and I wanted to ride motocross, and my father insisted, and his business partner insisted, that I learn to ride trials first before riding motocross, just to get some skills. And luckily, that worked out really good because I went to my first event and I got a big trophy. As a kid, there was like 30 of us in the kid class. Anyway, I got a big trophy and I was hooked. So shortly after that, a couple of years after that, I got a proper trials bike instead of just a mini bike. and continued to progress up in the Pacific Northwest, and moved up to the expert class, and then started riding nationals, and a little bit similar to Curt, not quite to the same level. I never lived in Europe, but I went and rode the Scottish 6 days and got some experience there, and rode several world rounds in 1983 in France and Austria, and stayed with Terry Michaud and Bernie Schreiber, and just worked with those guys and practiced and trained, and then basically was able to live the trials lifestyle with working for importers. I worked for the SWM importer and the Fantic importer, so we automatically were going to all the nationals, and it was an opportunity to see the country and get some experience riding and learning to work on motorcycles, etc. And then fast forward a little bit to 1984, when they announced that there was going to be this Olympics of motorcycle trials, and we knew what Motocross des Nations was at that point. It was exciting to hear about it, and then it kind of evolved into the opportunity for us to go and attend, which is a whole story. It's actually quite amusing, our trip and how that unfolded, and what we did while we were there.
So the U.S. gets notice that this is going on, and by the U.S. we mean who announced it? How did they figure out who's going to the TDN? What was that like?
I don't recall exactly, but I do know that Marilyn Wicker was involved with the initial fundraising. I'm pretty sure that can't remember the AMA rep at the time.
I think it was Connie Fleming.
Yeah, that sounds
and
right.
She just recently retired, if I recall.
Yeah. So there was an opportunity. So they talked to each of the manufacturers at the time, the importers, to see who was interested, or would they be able to support, and who would the prospective riders be. And Curt and Morgan Kavanaugh and myself were agreed upon with that group being, the riding ability was one qualification. Being good ambassadors for the United States was another. Being good mechanically, because we were going to be going over there unsupported. We brought our own tools, we brought our own motorcycles as our luggage. So we had to be mechanically inclined enough to be able to support ourselves with little to no spares. And they wanted riders that had experience traveling abroad. And so we all fit the bill there. And we were, pretty easygoing, easy to get along with. We all were, good. We were good teammates. We worked well together. And so the selection process was very organic at that point. And because it was the first time, there wasn't an official sequence or anything. But yeah, that was a lot of fun. And then Marilyn did all of the fundraising herself. She went to every national, and they had T-shirts made, and she would sell the T-shirts and take donations. And she put in a lot of work. And, this is before the internet. We had no idea.
It's incredible. And I'm sure it was it can be abstract if there's not a rider present when you're trying to fundraise now and people know what it is. But when no one knew what the event was, to try to fundraise for this ambitious thing probably had to be very difficult.
Yeah. Really, the only way it was advertised was on site at the nationals and club events. But what was the predecessor, it was basically the first trials publication in the United States. It was in newspaper format, was Trials Competition, USA. And prior to that, it was Plonkers Press. But they ran a lot of ads, and there was a form that you could clip out and out of the newspaper and send it off to get your shirt. Check the box of large, extra large, double X, and you could order it that way via mail, which nobody would even think about now. So people were really supportive to take those extra steps back in the day, because now you can't hardly get anybody to pick up a piece of paper and mail something. It has to be online for anybody to donate, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's so cool how many through lines there are organizationally from all the way back to 1974 to now even. Mm-hmm. But with Plunker's Press, I believe that has eventually become On the Pegs.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
So the level of full circle that is, plus On the Pegs still does advertising for the TDN fundraising, and
absolutely,
that's really amazing how much has changed and how little has changed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And just like now with On the Pegs, we all sit around and wait. Oh, when does it come out? When does it it hit? I just got the email or the text and I can see it now. The same thing back in the day with Plunker's Press. You would wait at the post, at the mailbox and get that piece of paper out there, and I still have stacks and stacks of them. So, you're right. It has come full circle. It's pretty cool.
So the location of this Trial to Nations, it wasn't just a Europe trip, but on top of that, it was in Soviet Poland.
Yeah. And
so can you tell me what it was like to get over there? Can you tell me what it was like to be received there?
Well, sure. And, and to kind of elaborate on what David was saying as far as us we didn't have team support. We had to carry on bikes and spares and that sort of thing. Well, it was kind of the same for everybody because, the factories really couldn't just get there either and set up. And of course, the support then isn't what it is now, but, no big haulers, transporters or whatever, but we did have, factory support like at the world rounds and stuff. So if we had an issue, we could get a part or technical or whatever, but that wasn't necessarily the case at TDN, at least as I remember. And being that it was a Soviet bloc country before, fall of the wall or whatever, the folks that rode trials there, the locals, just incredibly enthusiastic individuals. But, they were also hungry for Western goods because they were riding on Soviet-made motorcycles, or PKS, I think, was a Polish brand that a lot of them rode on. And, of course, we've got the fancy riding gear and Charles helmets and Pirelli tires or Michelin's or whatever it was back then. I think we were Michelin's by then.
Yeah.
And they couldn't get those things. So anyway, getting there and setting up the bikes and everything was it just took some planning and effort. And I'll even talk about that a little bit. But what was interesting also is when I left, it's like my bike was raped. I mean, there were no shocks, there were no tires, there were no grips. Every T-shirt I had, every sticker I had, I traded it for valuable stuff, because they couldn't get that, So I got leather goods and all kind of keepsakes to take home with me. And I always say a good deal is a good deal when everybody's happy, and they were so happy to get stuff that they couldn't get that they were willing to trade things that were of value to me. For and also when kids want your stickers and stuff, it's like it's flattering. So so I mean that was certainly a dynamic, and and I learned a lot about the dynamics of the world and the politics and stuff during that trip, because that was, you may remember, that Lech Walesa solidarity movement was going on then. So there's a big labor, movement. I wouldn't say civil unrest, but there was a labor movement going on.
It wasn't smooth.
So
it was bumpy. Yeah.
And so, everything in those Soviet countries, it was interesting that there was a little black market, free market or capitalistic market, but it was black market. It was, you go to the city squares and you could buy and trade for stuff, particularly if you had Western currency, but people would shield you. So, the authorities wouldn't see the transaction. And it was kind of exciting, but I don't know. So there was a bus company, Debniki, that was the sponsor of the club that hosted us. And so you may remember Krzysztof Kimiczykiewicz was the club trainer. That was his job, nutrition and fitness and all this for the Debniki Bus Company Trials Club. Yeah. It's how cool is that? Well, I got to stay at their house And it was interesting because he was actually East German, but he lived in Poland, and he had just enormous library in what I would call his den, of his apartment. They call it a flat. And, he was well-versed in various languages, but also, he's showing me some of his literature and stuff, and he said, oh, yeah, this one is really no, in Poland, like, whatever it was. And but his daughter Monica was studying to be a pharmacist, so she had to learn English and obviously Latin for the medicines. So she was our translator. And so anyway, I learned a lot staying with them. They were a very warm, loving family with passion for motorsports. And then there was another guy you may recall, Jacek Grochowski.
Grochowski, yeah.
Yeah.
He was a treat.
He was. So he picked me up at the airport, and this Yugo, like a mustard yellow Yugo. So and we can go into how we got the bikes there, but nonetheless, we shoved all the bikes, my bike, and all my crates, my bike, my engine, my wheels, my tools, my riding gear, in the back of this Yugo, and he sets off. And Jacek, if you remember, David, he was just wide open. Everything he did was like 100 mile an hour, 110%. He spoke fast, he drove fast, so we're leaving the airport, and we're like almost squealing. The tires are going around the roundabout, the bike's shifting in the back. And he reaches over and whips open the glove box, and out on the dash, a fuzzbuster, and he just laughs. Very illegal in Poland. He's so happy to show me his fuzzbuster.
And I totally remember that. He had a name for it. I think it was Sergeant.
Yeah. So he was what was he, a crystallographer or something? He was and so he was a professor at Krakow, I think, university. Yeah. But he did a spell at, where was it? Washington University or somewhere in the Mid-Atlantic?
I'm not sure where it was, but he
did a spell,
in the US for a little bit.
And he made a point that, they didn't allow his wife and his son to come, but he did like 2 years. And in his typical broken English, wide open conversation style, he assures me that since he's been there, he's practically American, and he even had a Buick. So I'm like, okay, I like this guy.
Yeah. He was fun. He was a lot of fun.
It sounds like a really warm welcome from the people, which I'm sure going into that situation, you weren't exactly sure what you were going to end up with.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, once you got through customs, it was unbelievable. The people were, friendly. Even the people on the street, and motorcycle people, obviously, we were family. But even the people on the street, they loved their kids and wanted a better life for the kids than they had, and they were friendly and open and helpful. And
we stuck out like a sore thumb.
Well, yeah,
because we had USA colors on.
Yeah.
Jackets and shirts or whatever, and everybody else, we're wearing red, white, and blue, and everyone else is wearing gray and brown.
Yeah.
And so there was no hiding us. I mean, we stuck out like a sore thumb. But everyone was really, really wonderful.
I had no bad experiences with anyone.
Yeah. And they were craving outside. What's it like? Tell us about where you're.
Well,
and
from. With that, not to interrupt, but Monica's, we're listening to some radio, so she's translating, the propaganda, and then we find Radio Free Europe, and we're listening to that. But what she translated me, at the time we were over there was General Motors had a labor strike going on, and the spin that was put on that, by the government radio, the propaganda of, Western economies are terrible, the government's terrible, look what they're doing in USA now, and they're just, indoctrinating the people how terrible all that is. But I think, the bulk of the people in Poland by then had knowledge of what life was outside of Poland, and that's why the Solidarity movement was taking root. And eventually they, things changed and they got their freedom, and here we are.
Yeah.
So you disassembled your bikes, crated them, boarded the plane to this new adventure. How far before the TDN did you arrive? How long did you have to get your bike back together? What were those logistics like in preparation? Was the format anything like it is now? Did you get to walk the sections in advance?
Yeah, so we had, I think we traveled on Monday or Tuesday, and then there was no section walking, nothing. We rode on Saturday morning. That was it. And it's just, you had your start minute, and I don't recall that we got to start exactly together as our team riders, 3 minutes
to ride together.
We got split up, and all of the other riders were split up, so you were mixed up with everybody else.
It was kind of like just your regular trials. You walk the sections and you ride them.
Yeah, it was a regular FIM. It's like a world round.
Mm-hmm.
But we took our bikes apart, carried them as luggage. One piece of luggage was an engine, one piece was front and rear wheel, and we zip tied those together and wrapped the chain around the sprocket, fenders on the top of that, and then another piece was we did the front forks and the swing arm, shocks, etc. And so it looked like a little horse. And we made canvas covers for these so that you didn't see what was in them, but they looked very strange. We carried our own engine oil because we didn't know if we would be able to get engine oil there. These were 2-strokes, so we had to carry our own premix. We carried, small tire pumps, to air the tires up when we got there, and it was quite a mess. A funny story about the oil we had to carry. Chuck West was the team manager, and Marilyn, she helped with the donations and got all the fundraising. But Chuck was the mechanic and team manager. Well, Chuck didn't have luggage to carry as motorcycle parts, so we gave Chuck all the engine oil. Well, somewhere along the trip, one of the engine oil bottles burst or broke, and we get to Warsaw, and we're unloading all the bags, and the whole side of his bag is oily. And we're like, oh no, that's too bad. Well, then he opens it up, and all of his clothing for the trip was saturated in, it was a CalGuard oil, which has molybdenum in it, so it's got metal. It looks like it looks like used oil. It was black, and it was terrible, and all of his oil, and it didn't wash out. And we didn't have access to a laundromat or anything like that, so it was challenging just from the start. But so we got all that stuff. Yatsik and was it Christopher or Christoph?
Christoph.
Yeah, Christoph got us to a location where we could put the bikes together. And keep in mind, the entire time that we were in Poland, we had escorts. We weren't allowed to be in country without an approved Polish national escort. Now, it wasn't state assigned, but these guys had to be vetted out and qualified that they were okay for
Well,
this.
and you went through customs. That was part of the paperwork you did. So you had to exchange your currency.
Yep.
Of course, I had some Western currency. That was really handy. And but anyway, you had to exchange your currency, and you had to state your purpose, how many days, where you were staying, who you were going to be with, and their contact. Yeah. So, that was part of getting in the customs.
Which honestly, I was completely good with, because I'm like, we was landed on a different planet with. I mean, I have to this day, I have one Polish word that I can remember, and it's dziękuję, which is thank you. I said thank you a lot, and that's all I can remember that I learned. But it was nice to have those guys, and they'd take us to breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Mm-hmm. We went to, so the state, because we were athletes, we qualified to go into the state-run cafeteria for athletes. So we actually went to a training facility in this cafeteria, and there's all these athletes in red jumpsuits with white stripes and the Polish flag, and it was gymnasts and swimmers and all these people. They would go to this one location and get the good food, because you couldn't just go to the grocery store and get stuff. So we, and Yatsik and Christoph ate with us, and they were super excited because they're like, this is special, and it was a little ball of cottage cheese and a little trout and a tomato and a bowl of porridge, and that was breakfast, and they were overjoyed, and we were all sitting there looking going, is this all we get for breakfast? And they thought it was special. And they were thankful that they were hanging out with us because they got to eat like kings for a day. But anyway, it was we were with them the whole time. And it was a huge blessing to have them and get to meet them and know them. So.
And what I was going to just add is that there was gasoline rationing going on during that time, and they had squirreled some back. Maybe they had resources through Debnicki or whatever to make sure that we had enough gas to.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
So, but, it was quite an experience. It really was. And the people were wonderful.
You'd both been to Europe already competing, and you knew some of the other riders. Did you get to share that experience with some of the riders from other countries who you already knew that came for that event? What was that interaction like? Did you get to prepare it all with them, or was there any kind of paddock area where you could prepare?
Yeah, there was a very small paddock, and like Curt mentioned earlier, there's a very limited number of vehicles. I think most of the riders arrived in their own personal. Some of them drove vans, like two guys would go in a van. I think there may have been a small Fantic van and Beta, which Morgan rode a TR32, the very first Beta single shock trials bike. It was the first one imported into the United States, is the one that he rode at Myślenica in Poland at the TDN. So it was his national bike. He was riding the nationals and he took that over. So we did get to see, friends that we had relationships with, etc. We got lucky because Jacek and Christoph took us to a little practice area where we could actually, and it wasn't approved or anything. We just rode our trials bikes down the road and went out and got to go ride and practice. I don't recall any of the other riders. Certainly none of them rode where we rode. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't an official practice area at the venue. It was a high school that we rode out of, and it was a cinder running track, was in a soccer pitch in the middle where the start of the venue.
And they had like a stadium section there.
Right.
And, it was amazing. So it's like all the townspeople showed up, in their coats and ties, and but all the townspeople showed up. So there was lots of spectators. That's something big that came to their town or their region or whatever, and they're not going to miss that because it's a big deal. So a little story about traveling over there, because I know you touched on that. But so I traveled separate actually, and I had a Montesa Coda 242, so fiberglass gas tank. So I packaged things like David said. The engine was in a crate, and then the wheels were and the forks were in the zip tied together, and the chassis was all bundled, and some tools and stuff. But this fiberglass tank seat unit, it's like, ooh, that could be easily damaged. So this, obviously before TSA, that was my carry-on baggage.
Oh, my goodness, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. So I flew from Chattanooga to Atlanta and then changed planes to go to Atlanta to Frankfurt. And I'm walking down the jetway or whatever, in the airport. I don't know if it's security or whatever, but a very official-looking lady stopped me and inquired about what I was carrying. I said, well, it's a vessel. What kind of a vessel? Well, it's a container. What kind of a container? Well, for liquid. Anyway, she eventually had it out of my hands and the gas cap off, and she's smelling it. It's like, there's been gas in here. I said, yes, but I scrubbed it really good. So this evolved into quite the conversation. So, I'm out with my FIM license, my entries, explained to her that I'm representing the United States, and this is fiberglass, and it's very fragile, and it has to go. And anyway, I just wore her out with words, and she finally just said, go on. And so anyway, it went on carry-on luggage with me. So we flew then Atlanta to Frankfurt, then Frankfurt to Warsaw. Then I took a domestic flight from Warsaw to Krakow.
Yeah.
So the no jetways there. It's like, well, in going from the international airport to the domestic airport in Warsaw was a whole nother trip. I'm in a cabbie. What is those things? A Lada, Fiat, a Lada. And of course, the cabbie, I got my map. I don't speak in Polish, but I can see which roads, and we're going around the world. He's running up the fare. Anyway, we point and you gesture and whatever, and he gets me to the airport. So there's no jetways or anything. So, you're And of course, you're in a Soviet bloc country now. And so, you're waiting, and then your plane's ready. So everybody walks in a line. Let's see, I don't think we had a bus. I think we walked from the lobby or whatever to the plane. And then there's these steps going in the back of this turboprop Soviet-made plane. And I go in, and there's like a guard in the back seat.
Yeah.
He's got his rifle, whatever. I nod as I go by. And anyway, you go in, and just the whole experience. I mean, the seats were like aluminum frame with that nylon webbing, like a, patio chair. And I'm lined up. So they seat me by the wing, and I'm lined up with that prop, we start to taxi out, and that thing's out there, the window, is lined up with my head, and he's throttling it up. I'm thinking, man, I hope that a blade doesn't come off of that thing. So that was the experience. But we take off, and then stewardess comes along with this bowl of hard candy. And in America, you used to everything individually wrapped and all. And this is just a bowl of candy, and everybody's just dipping in and grabbing some. And it's like, well, I don't really want to touch that, but other people have. But, I want to fit in, so I got me some. And as we go on up in altitude, it's like I realized why the hard candy. It's like their cabin pressure wasn't so great.
Yeah.
It's like you need to swallow and adjust your ears or whatever. And so anyway, we're flying, and we get closer to Krakow in this big storm. And I mean, this plane is like all over the place. And, and I'm hanging on. And then, you can see the landing lights are out, and through the rain and the fog, you can start to see the ground. And I mean, we're just all over the place. And I'm thinking, well, I'm bracing. I said, oh, this one's going to be rough. And man, that guy set that thing down like he just laid on a pillow. It was amazing. He knew what he was doing.
That's awesome.
And then, but that was just kind of a new experience. I wasn't used to the flying around. And the armed guard in the back, that was just so people don't defect.
Yeah.
Keep everybody in, In this country, you were always used to, security to keep people out of your stuff.
Yeah.
That was a different dynamic. It's a lot of effort to keep people in.
Yeah. That's I hadn't heard that one before.
So let's talk a little bit about the actual trial. It sounds like did you travel between towns for the trial? Was it kind of split up like in England? Sometimes it's across farms. What was that like? Was there a city center? What were the sections like? What was the weather like?
Yeah, so the event started at a high school, and it was a running track it was like a little stadium. And that I recall, so the terrain was very much like Oregon. So very muddy, wet streams, steep banks that you would go in and out of, and traction was a big issue. The event itself, for me, it was one of the hardest days on a motorcycle ever. It was very demanding. It was a challenging event. I mean, it was a hard trial, like a world round was. And again, the sections were difficult, but it was rainy, muddy, and I just remember a lot of pushing and that. And it was a long day. When we finished, we had to tear the bikes back apart and put them back as luggage. Although my bike may not have made it out of the country. That actually changed possession in Poland with some fancy footwork, and it stayed there. So
which had to be fancy because we had to have a carnet.
I know, and I don't know how they swung it, but Yatsik got my bike.
All right.
And my boots and helmet and all that kind of stuff. So he was like factory rider afterwards. He got all that new stuff. But the event was hard.
Yes, it was.
A lot of work. That you see the pictures of us. There's a great picture of Curt with, I think the front fender is broken off, and he's just mud head to toe, and he just looks gassed. He's just done.
And I was.
And then
I can't remember that.
And then we still had to work on bikes and get everything ready to go. But
how many sections was it?
If I recall correctly, it was
I guess 18.
Yeah, I think it was 2 laps of 18.
Yeah. And like David said, it was very much like a world round in that era. So, I don't know that we necessarily went from farm to farm, but it was a pretty long loop, if I recall, and quite a lot of sections. like David said, it was raining and muddy, and and they were good sections, and they were rocky. And I did have some loss of control of my motor vehicles, breaking fenders and such. And I remember that I was having problems with, overheating, so the mud would get clogged in the fins because no water cooling, obviously. And so I was stopping to clean out the fins of the cylinder so it wouldn't overheat. And I think I even broke rear fenders. By the time I got done with the trials, I looked pretty bad. But
a little bit less to crate up at the end.
Well, yes. Yeah. But, and it was just such an experience. It was such an honor being there and competing at that level. It's like, and we were young too. It's like, all those inconveniences, they were just that. They were, there was just, trials was tough then, and that was just par for the course. I mean, we struggled at World Rounds, and we struggled there. But we did okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. We held our own even with our challenges.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, great experience. Great experience.
So did you fly back the next day? What was that like?
So Morgan Kavanaugh and Chuck West and Marilyn Wicker and myself all went on from there to Germany, and we went to Cologne to there's an annual motorcycle show there, big with new product introductions and that kind of stuff. So we went there, and I think Curt had to go fly back separately.
I can't remember why, but I didn't go there. Yeah. So, it wasn't that I wasn't a team player. It's just I had different commitments.
Yeah, but we got to stay an additional day in Krakow and went and visited. Did you stay with us to go visit? We saw some, in particular, an old church, the oldest church in Poland, a Christian church, and it had pockmarks on the steeple on the side from World War II, from airplanes, from guns, where it had been shot at. And were you there for that church?
I wasn't
think
there.
You might have.
I did go to the castle. I don't know if you went to the castle. That was
I didn't.
Before, and it was quite interesting. It was in Krakow, and I think it was from the 1100s, so quite old. And like the steps, I recall, were stone, but they were like worn down from centuries of foot travel. But at the time that I went there with Monica, there was a Soviet film crew. They were filming some movie there, so it was kind of interesting to see, them work. And it wasn't like, you couldn't. You weren't like walled off limits. You could actually see what was going on. It was kind of cool.
Yeah, we were on the Yachtzik tour, so we both got to do different stuff. But the church that we saw, this stained glass that was hundreds and hundreds of years old, and this, it was just an amazing place, and it was an artifact. When we were there, you weren't allowed to go and worship there. It was just, hey, this is something from a long time ago. We were able to walk through it and see it, but so we were able to spend an additional day and hang out with those guys, and then we went and spent another week in Germany after that. But I just remembered something funny that I had this similar story to Curt with when we flew from Warsaw to Krakow, a little tiny plane, and there's one soldier in the back with a Soviet rifle, and the kid that was holding it looked like he was probably 16. He didn't look old enough to be having an automatic weapon. But when we were all sat in the plane, they handed out the little orange candy, and then the stewardess, in very broken English, told or advised that if we wanted to get out of our seat for any reason, we had to talk to the boy with the automatic rifle. We all decided we were just going to stay seated for the whole trip. But
of course,
but it's an absolutely magical experience. I wish we didn't have. There's very limited number of photos. It's just our memories, and talking with Curt right now, it's jostling all these memories out of the cobwebs of my mind, and all the things that we were able to do when we were there. We had a wonderful experience, and it was such an honor to be able to represent the United States. Our helmets didn't arrive. We were all supposed to have Nolan helmets with the typical ISDE blue
skunk work.
the skunk helmet. We were supposed to get those, and I didn't get mine for like 6 or 7 years later. It had actually come to the AMA, and through it didn't end up getting shipped. And I had talked with Roger Ansel at one point, and he goes, "Oh yeah, by the way, I have this in my office. I need to get that to you." So he sent it off to me. So that was pretty cool.
Speaking of the photos, thank you so much for digging those photos that have never been circulated before up for this interview. I really appreciate it. And those will be in the upcoming edition of On the Pegs for you to see. It's amazing to me, aside from culturally it being a Soviet country at the time, how many parallels there are to the current TDN experience, having just gone through it. The amazement at how old the properties and the buildings on the properties are. It was just incredible. The photos from the 2025 TDN were taken at a 1200 site, and we're standing on ruins and we're riding up aqueducts. And it's so neat to hear about all of the parallels and all of the through lines, just like at the beginning when we talked about the magazines. Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me, and you're one of the few people that I know that can appreciate it. We were in the stadium, and each of the teams, there was a girl that held a sign that said USA on it.
That's right. Yeah.
And then on the other side of us, a girl with an American flag. And it wasn't a really big flag. It wasn't but we walked down, like where the 100-yard or 100-meter dash would be in front of the grandstands. We walked along, and I'm getting chills right now.
Yeah.
Just to be honored to do that. And, like say, so I'm getting emotional now, but you're one of the few that there's a pretty small group of people over the years that have had that experience and been able. It's as close as I can think is going to the Olympics and representing your country. Anyway.
Certainly. And I think that is a really moving experience. And I'm so glad that they have preserved the tradition of the Parade des Nations at the Trial des Nations. Yeah. It's a difficult contest for my favorite moment of that weekend, but the Parade des Nations certainly is at the top of the list. And now the teams are larger. There's a women's team, there's a challenge team, and whoever the newest members of the team get to carry the flag and the sign. And so this year, the 2 challenge team riders, it was their first time, they carried the sign, and I had the honor of carrying the flag. And it was one of the top moments of the weekend, and the way that it inspires you to, you're already there very motivated to do your best for your country, but the way that it kind of anchors you to that purpose is incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, well, congratulations on joining that group of people.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's a very
representing us well, us as Americans, but us as fellow trials enthusiasts and motorcycle enthusiasts.
Yeah, pretty elite fraternity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I appreciate it, and it's an honor to have my names anywhere near your names in the books here. So coming back, you're bringing, you're already at the top end of experience within the trials community for having trained in Europe each, and now you're bringing home this incredible experience and getting the next wave of riders ready to do the same thing and to get to represent the United States. I know personally you've both been wonderful mentors anytime I've been around you at locals or at nationals. What has that experience been like, getting to be that role model in the trials community for that, and obviously your other long lists of accomplishments?
Yeah. Well, I had the honor of being able to basically download my experience and some information. I think probably, Andy Somm and Mark Manico were the two guys that had gone not long after I had gone. And it's a pretty small fraternity, and you don't get a lot of opportunities. I mean, and when I say small fraternity, I mean trials riders in general. God bless you if you ride a bike with no seat. There's not very many of us out there. So we're always happy to share our information, and hopefully you get, someone that learns to enjoy trials the way we have and have those opportunities. And I think both of those guys are great examples of people that did get to come behind us. And Kurt's worked with, guys like Steve McNeil and some of anyway, a lot of
Well, this weekend's important because Ryan Young was inducted into the AMA Hall of Fame, and obviously he's on campus and riding events with us this weekend. But I rode with Ryan's dad, and then, of course, I remember when Ryan was a kid on a bicycle. So he's 10 years younger than we are, David. But, we've had a relationship since he was a kid. And he was always hungry for whatever I could give him. And, of course, the Trial to Nations experience, he was very inquisitive because, he definitely followed with multiple, times on the U.S. team. And there again, he's represented us quite well as a competitor and an individual. And I guess I probably invested more in him than anybody. But like you said, some of the guys back home, Steve McNeil and some of those for sure.
Yeah.
There have been very few men's teams to have won the international trophy ever since they split the championship. Both championships are incredibly competitive. In 2025, the men won. Yeah. And I know you've both seen all of those riders come up since they were kids.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about what it's like to see those dreams realized through that team?
Yeah, it's proud to be on the first part of it and see I'm proud of those guys. I mean I've Josh running around as a little guy. I think I've saw him with his helmet on backwards as a really little guy at one point. But and I've known his dad and his mom since before they were married and that. But seeing those families progress, I wasn't around the Myers boys because I was mostly a West Coast guy after that. But I'm just proud of those guys, and just it's great to see them growing up and flourishing, and it's such an accomplishment, man. It's so much pressure, and when you're in that stage with all of that going on, and again, you know firsthand, there's and it's pressure that we put on ourselves, right? Because of representing the United States. But yeah, it's cool to see their success for sure.
Wonderful. Let's talk briefly about what you guys are each doing now in your trials career, because neither of you have stepped away from the sport either. And I love that. I was just talking with Ryan about that earlier today, because I think the neatest part about his induction is that it's a huge milestone, but it's not an end point, because he's so passionate about motorsports and trials specifically. And I think what stands out to me about so many trials champions is that your trials career doesn't end at a championship. It doesn't end when you hit the big goal of going to Trial to Nations. It doesn't end when you hit those milestones. You stay in the sport. And so can you tell me each a little bit about what you're doing now in the sport, what's inspiring you?
Well, I've recently retired, and I had to take several years away from trials due to work obligations, but starting again in 2017, I started riding locally in Southern California, SCTA, riding the series there, and then I started riding nationals again, and these last 2 years I was able to ride every national, and was able to win the senior support class, both 2024 and 2025. Helped Daniel Blanc-Gagné this year with NATC National in California, and then help with SCTA with internally with setting up events. Just last weekend we had a ride after a trials. We left the trials set up, went back out, and a bunch of riders and myself re-rode the trial. And it was an opportunity for me to show the other riders that were struggling with sections, okay, I wasn't able to be there during the event, but here, let me watch you ride it, and then I'll critique your line choice or your, and it was really rewarding to see them try out, okay, this is a suggestion, this is how I would do it, and it helped them with their riding or help them lower their scores. It's been fun. I'm involved with that, and then also for the last 2 seasons, I've been helping U.S. Montesa with mechanic duties. In 2024, I prepared the bike for Toby Martin, and then in 2025, I prepared the bike for Jorge Casales. and both of them, won their championships. It was kind of fun. Many years ago, I was a race mechanic at Kawasaki Motors and built bikes for Baja and riders like Larry Rossler and Danny Laporte and Marty Smith and a lot of guys back in the day, and had a lot of success as a mechanic. And it was fun to do it again. And I learned a lot from those guys. Their bikes were a little different than what I would normally do for my setup, but I enjoyed learning from them, and I apply it to my bikes, and I think it's helped my riding. But I've stayed involved, and I enjoy going to the U Cup. I missed it last year due to illness, but we enjoy that. Curt and I love that event. It's a marquee event. Both of us have won it in the past, so we're in enjoy that. I enjoy doing events like the British American Cup in Northern California, which is a 3-day event that Adrian and Mandy Lewis promote, and it's kind of like 6 days, but it's here. And anyway, so doing that, mostly West Coast stuff, but like I say, these last 2 years, I hit all the nationals. Not sure if that's in the cards for this year or not, to be able to hit all of them, but definitely the West Coast stuff for sure.
So. And Curt?
Well, of course, the sport has changed a lot since our day, David, as far as like the riding styles and everything, the marking. And, we come from a time where there's, long loops, lots of sections, and, just different style or whatever, So, maybe I haven't stayed as current as you have as far as, the new techniques and that sort of thing. But being a dinosaur, I enjoy those traditional events like you just mentioned, U Cup in particular. And I even though I may not be as current on some of the new riding styles or whatever, as far as helping folks that are growing in the sport, I think basics of trials is a very important foundation. When I see a lot of young people, they want to learn the hops and turn into Tony Bo videos from the get-go, and it's like, well, there's more to the foundation to be able to then go to those advanced techniques. I'm honored when somebody asks for my input on their riding style. And of course, the joy for me right now is my 7-year-old grandson. He's on a TRS 16 and
nice,
and enjoying trials and enjoying motorcycles. And I guess that's it for me, is just a lifelong motorcyclist. Trials, has been really good to me, and I encourage all my friends, motorcycle inclined people, to have some involvement in trials, because what you learn in trials as far as your motorcycle handling skills and everything transition to anything you do in motorcycles. But also, you talked about the community, the motorcycle community. There's life lessons, there's life friendships, there's just a lot of good. And we live in crazy times now. And I always tell Dewana, gosh, if everybody just raced motorcycles, they wouldn't have time or money for all this foolishness that's going on in our society. And I guess I believe that. My motorcycle friends are my family, and it's where I'm in my comfort zone. And trials has been really good to me. And, like the U.S. championship that I won was a long time ago, but, it's, I guess, flattering when people do remember or appreciate or respect that. And it's helped me in a lot of ways. I mean, it's opened doors that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to walk through. So trials has been very good to me, and all the relationships, everything from riders to, in particular, I mean, I had the best sponsors. Kawasaki Motors was great to me. Cosmopolitan Motors, Larry Wise, I mean, he's like a father. But he never rode motorcycles. He just loved trials and trials people. So lots and lots of good experiences there. And, it was riding the Trial to Nations is probably an ultimate or a culmination or whatever, because, we did get to do the first one. So that was groundbreaking. But as we mentioned, you're representing your country. And I mean, I still have like enormous national pride. And, it hurts me, some of the things I see, but when I see our Americans in motorcycles flying the flag and representing our country, that makes me very proud.
Yeah. Yeah, well said.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you both so much. I greatly appreciate your time, and I greatly appreciate that we were all brought together by the induction this weekend.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's it for today's episode with David Pyle and Curt Comer. Guys, thank you both for sitting down and sharing these stories, especially for the first time together. It's incredible to hear firsthand what the first Trial Donations experience was like and how it all came together. You can find show notes for this episode over on the On the Pegs website, including ways to support the current U.S. Trial Donation team through their fundraising efforts. And as always, thank you for listening to the On the Pegs podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, share it with a friend, and we'll catch you in the next one.